It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Rob Dobberstein. Rob, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon as we kind of dig into the next phase of these webinar series. And we're going to start off looking at the full building evacuation planning and some of the best practices as we really look at the healthcare industry. And as we start to look at this webinar, we also want to kind of point out that we've got a variety of different levels of care that are participating, that this is also going to apply at different ranges and for different areas and meetings, whether it be for different codes or different spectrums like CMS regs that just recently came out for skilled nursing and hospitals and others that are there. So we're going to try covering it along those lines so that we can capture best practices for all the participants that are on today. As we begin and we start to look at these two, as I said, we are going to dig into full building first. We'll then transition and look at the surge capacity plan and the development to making sure that we capture all the best practices for your current plans. So at this point, the first thing that we want to start off with is we do have an interactive poll question here for everybody just to kind of take a look at for the full building evacuation plan. Rich has just popped up here for you. And basically what we're going to look at is that which of the following does your full building plan not address? And I'll just kind of help to summarize. We've got some pretty long answers here, but number one is making sure that you have a tracking method for residents and or patients. Number two, looking for a tracking method for staff and volunteers if they're getting sent to another location or getting sent home. Number three, do you have a method for sharing medical information, charts, and while still at the same time being able to preserve any confidentiality? And then do you have agreements with other facilities that are in the same level of care in which you are at? And have they accepted agreements to receive your patients? And at the same time, built into your plan, do you also have an agreement with an alternate care site that could be used? Not a healthcare facility, but an area that could be something like a church, a rec center, something like that. And select any of those that would not apply.
And I'll just chime in here, Rob. Rob, I'll just chime in here to say that this is multiple choice. So if you're doing several of these, you can select multiple options.
Okay, so based on at least what we're looking at here, it looks like we've got a lot of people that have mainly the core. When we think of a full building evacuation plan, we certainly need to have tracking methods that are in place for residents and patients, but at the same time having tracking methods. As you look at all of these different things that are kind of questions that are getting posed to everybody here, everybody's plan should have all of these getting addressed at some level and some detail within their evacuation plans. So we're going to go through and we look at this best practices and how can we go about addressing these and some of the ways that we've learned from actual experiences that we can go forward and improve on any plans that we have. One of the big things as we get started here, though, is to look at and to understand is that the full building evacuation, it's an exception, not a rule, when it comes time for leaving a healthcare facility. And I think that kind of goes without saying with a lot of us that we understand that we're going to do everything in our power to stay in the building and to avoid to have to leave. But at some point in time, the building is going to tell us, I no longer can support you and the care of the individuals that are inside of it, that we have to start making the decision when is it that we're going to have to start to evacuate. And that's truly then when this plan comes into play. It's very rare that it has to happen. However, we've seen in many different situations, like you see here in this list of case studies, that it's happened. And a lot of these here, while they are larger storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that, where these have forced us to evacuate, it's not always just these large tropical events that force us to have to evacuate, but typically a lot of it is forced off of the central services that are tied to our building that force us also to have to leave. So there's a lot of different ways and means that could force us to have to use this plan. We're going to look at a couple of these, and the first one that we're going to look at here is, and from our experience here with Russell Phillips Associates, this particular hospital, Cape Canaveral, is one of the hospitals that we've learned the most when it comes time for understanding full building evacuation and better practices as to how do we go about doing it. This particular hospital has had to evacuate 4 times in a period of 5 years. They've had to evacuate to other hospital systems. They've had to go through struggles of learning how do we go through and evacuate out of this facility, getting transportation there, getting people up and downstairs to be able to manipulate this multi-story building. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learned. And obviously, I know we're talking to a lot of folks here that are for Florida. When it comes time for a hurricane, we're certainly not going during it, but it is a pre-evacuation of that hurricane. So there's a lot of things that have to be thought of at that point in time. And as you can see, looking at Cape Canaveral Hospital, just with the picture in itself, there's a lot of things that already present itself as being some issues. I mean, transportation-wise, kind of one way in, one way out, and multi-story building, how are we going to go about evacuating, getting people down, but going through the process of tracking where people are going. There's a lot of things, and we'll emphasize and point out some of these things as we go through the full building evacuation plan that we've learned from Cape Canaveral Hospital. One of the other ones that we've had more recent experiences with was the Joplin Healthcare Center in Joplin, Missouri. They had a tornado that ended up going through, and multiple healthcare facilities, including the major trauma hospital in Joplin, were devastated by this tornado that ended up going through for approximately 16 miles, doing damage to the community and a lot of the healthcare facilities. This particular client ended up going through, they ended up having severe damage to their roof. They ended up having so much pressure in the building that staff reported that their ears were popping, glasses blowing out of the rooms and into rooms. They ended up having sprinkler pipes that were breaking. They ended up having a gas main that ended up starting to leak on the outside of the building. They had ceilings inside of the building that started to collapse. Pretty much everything that you could think of that would happen during a tornado situation pretty much did for this particular healthcare facility. However, at the same time, they also had a lot of things that happened to this particular facility that they were not prepared for. Most of the time when you have that much damage, the facility tends to think, okay, the building no longer can support us, so we have to start to evacuate. However, the challenge they had was that there was no way to get resources for them to evacuate because the amount of damage that was done surrounding them. Staff, fortunately, all remained on site, many of which that were off duty actually were able to get back to the facility that lived nearby and reported back to continue care of the people that were there. However, the biggest thing that they were not prepared for is that when this tornado went through and caused damage to other healthcare facilities and the major trauma hospital, the community no longer had a place to go. And they looked at this healthcare facility, even though all the damage they had now suffered, they looked at them as saying, hey, here's a nursing facility. Nursing means care. It means treatment. I need help. And they started to surge and influx this healthcare facility. This particular facility ended up not only taking care of their own residents and family members and visitors that were there, but they also set up their own treatment center on the outside of the building, and they also began handling care and treatment for the surrounding community until emergency services could actually show up and start to help and provide care for those that were there and around them. They ended up having to figure out in the process of all of this going on, how are we going to go about getting people safely taken care of, packaged, and ready to go for when it became time to evacuate, and how are we going to evacuate them. They began going through and taking medications, personal effects, and bagging them into pillowcases and bags and putting identification on those bagging as well as on those individuals physically on their arm so that those records, the belongings, all matched up with those individuals so that during transport they did not get shipped to another location nor did they get separated. They ended up using, out of their fire procedures, or tagging method, which they used to mark rooms for fire room and evacuated room, but they used their evacuating tags as a way to say, we've searched the room, this unit is now empty, we've gotten everybody off this unit, and then they could go back through on the final sweep once the building was evacuated to ensure that everyone truly was accounted for and evacuated out of the facility. So they had multiple tiers of evacuating and tracking accountability, as well as doing a safety or security sweep of the building at the same time. The challenge that they had here when it came time to move was, where are we going to move to? Because they had so many local facilities that were also under the same problem and same pressures of evacuating, they had no place to go. It took a lot of effort to be able to coordinate where is it that we needed to go and how to get there. They had no support from outside agencies, emergency management, fire department, EMS, for over 2 hours after the event had taken place. They coordinated their own transportation using personal vehicles, buses, trucks, whatever they could get their hands on from the surrounding community and staff to coordinate transportation to the receiving sites, which they were able to determine with multiple levels and phone calls. They had to, once they did that, coordinate how are we going to help to the receiving facilities, make sure that those facilities can provide equivalent care at those sites. They ended up coordinating getting pickup trucks and box trucks to be able to load wheelchairs, vans, medical records, any pieces of equipment they could to take them to those locations where they were sending people to. However, one of the challenges that they had was that as they were doing this transport and as people were trying to get back to the facility, they had challenges of getting people through the police roadblocks. Probably one of the biggest things that I would reach out to all of you and encourage you to look at for your current staffing identification is, one, we always encourage it to be a name and photo identification. So that way it matches up with your facility, them, and their picture. If it's not a photo identification, at least most people have a driver's license that we can put 2 and 2 together. The big thing is encourage staff members not to leave it at a desk, in an office, hanging on a bulletin board, have them take it home with you, because in the event you need to do a staff callback, that's the identification that you can tell law enforcement, my staff members have ID badges that look like this. Please help to get them back. One of the challenges that Joplin faced was they could not get additional people back because they didn't have identification to gain access back to their site. One of the things that each site, and this is one of the questions that we popped up, and then those of you that kind of fall under the new CMS requirements, the use of, or at least having available for a stopover point. And the stopover point initially here became the use of another healthcare facility. But we always want to look at the use of even non-healthcare facilities that we could use as an emergency evacuation site, and then figure out, do we need to go further? Looking at what types and means and methods, they ended up using a census log, basically, for their evacuation out, checking people off as they left and as they arrived at receiving facilities. Typically, what we have in our plans, we would recommend that there is a form that is pre-used that we can do a baseline, what's going on with this person. It's almost like a medical transportation form. Basically, when it comes time for going in a fast evacuation, that form is a quick summary of the medical chart. So instead of having to go through all the details of what's there, if we have to go out quickly, there's a quick, this person's a wander risk, they're a fall risk, here's the allergies that may be pertinent medical history for this person, for that receiving site, to continue the care until you are able to staff that receiving site to continue the care of those residents in which they're receiving. They chose, in this case in Joplin, they just did it as a census log. However, because the medical records and medications were getting trucked later, there was a long period of time where the receiving site had nothing to work with. They didn't know who they were receiving other than a name that was there and the minimum, here's the personal effects that were stuffed in a bag and tied to their wrist kind of thing. So how can we best coordinate that information with those receiving facilities? when it comes time and we look at evacuation and some of the realities that are there, that healthcare evacuations, and almost like preaching to the choir here, you know as better than I do that it's not going to be a short incident. It is going to be an extended incident, and it is going to take a significant amount of time. But we have to look at it really in two different directions, as to a slower paced evacuation versus a longer paced evacuation, or quicker evacuation, excuse me. There are some things that may force us to have to get out a little bit faster. You know, people always look at something like a fire. Fire is not something that's typically going to force us to have to evacuate out quickly because our buildings are so protected from it. However, if the fire department says, get out now, that's where a stopover point comes in, where we take and we get everybody under a roof, and then we reorganize, gather our thoughts, and we come up with a game plan. However, there are other incidents that, and I always use, if you lose water, the city and town comes to you and say you lose water and you lose sewage, and they tell you you're going to be out of water and sewage for the next 3 weeks, we're certainly not going to stay, but we certainly aren't going to sit there and go running out the door. We've got time to package and come up with a plan as to where are people going to go. And that this plan, this full building evacuation plan, is just one piece of the puzzle that ties into all of the other emergency preparedness or emergency operations that we come up with to figure out what is the next steps along the lines as we start making those decisions through our incident command system. The overall methodology behind the full building evacuation plan, typically this. Before we do any movement, before the order gets to evacuate, we begin to prepare and package our residents or patients on their units, on the floors, on the departments before we start running them out of the building. And I say running in quotes. At that point in time, the command center, when it is appropriate, determines which area is the greatest threat to move first, and at that point, we send people to begin helping with the move of that area, and we take them to an internal holding area where we can then sort them, triage them, and figure out where they're going to go. The command center will be the one that determines when do we evacuate, what facilities are going to be accepting which residents, and once transportation has been received, at that point, we then take them from the holding area, place them onto transport, and then we start sending them to other facilities and or possibly even have the ability to start discharging people. Again, depending upon the level of care, there may be some that we can go and say, you're free to go home. You're here for therapy. You're supposed to get discharged tomorrow. Let's discharge you today. That's one less person we have to place. At the same time, we have to consider that when we're evacuating and we're going to another receiving facility, that we're going to like for like care. We can always go up in care. We can go skilled nursing to a hospital, but we can't go skilled nursing going down to an assisted or independent living. We've got to go like for like care. And I also kind of add in here is that, you know, it's easy to be able to say skilled nursing to skilled nursing, but even that is not like for like care unless the services match what that patient needs at that skilled nursing facility. Some of the key components that should be looked at for your full building evacuation plan. A labor pool. One of the biggest challenges is that if we start to go through a process and not have the coordination of staff, if we have too many staff trying to do too many things, it's going to hinder us and slow us down. So we activate a labor pool. We get everybody to report to one area. One person's in charge of the labor pool, and then it gives a pool of people in which the command center then can reach out and start to give assignments to. One of the assignments would be to establish an internal holding area, which will be the sorting or triaging point once we start the evacuation. Coordinating a transportation. We should be assigning through the incident command system a liaison officer to start working with outside resources to coordinate transportation, what's available, and this also can be something that is built into your mutual aid agreements as you work with other facilities. Will you accept the patients, but also can I use your transportation if we have to evacuate, and vice versa, you back to them. And then determining those receiving sites, as we said, the like-for-like care, and resident packaging, making sure that when we trigger for this full evacuation to take place, that the staff members understand what the resident preparation and packaging actually means and stands for. What expectations is it that we're looking for them to actually do? Make sure they're packing charts, medications, personal effects and belongings, and make sure that they're identified so that as they're going through that tracking process. In the labor pool, again, as part of the tracking, should not just be tracking of residents and patients, but we also have to make sure that we're tracking staff and volunteers that are in the building and working in the building at that point in time. And I will emphasize this, that for those of you that, again, that fall under those new CMS requirements that are now in play, that the tracking of staff and including volunteers is a big part of making sure that that is covered in this plan and other parts of your emergency operations plan. So we want to have a point where we can log staff in, log staff out. Where are they going to go? If they're going to be transporting with other staff members, how is it that we can actually get to them, and where are they going? The labor pool unit leader is also going to assign evacuation groups. One of the biggest things that we learned from Cape Canaveral was that, most facilities, they go through, okay, we're going to start to evacuate, we're going to go and we're going to start evacuating the third floor first, and now a mass group of people all start running up to the third floor, and now we start bringing people down the stairs because we don't have the use of elevators, and now we got to go all the way back up and repeat the cycle again. Staff are going to start breaking down, we're going to lose the effectiveness of that evacuation. So what ended up getting developed was they did basically a bucket brigade, where there were potentially 3 to 4 different groups that were formed. If we've got elevators, we probably don't need to use the stairs. But the first group is the floor discharge group. They go to the unit or department or the floor, and they begin assisting with the packaging and the movement horizontally on that floor to get people to the stairwell or the elevator. Assuming we've got elevators, you got one person then in an elevator that is just taking it up and down to the appropriate floor. And then the discharge floor takes people from that elevator down the hallway to our holding area, where people would then be sorted and triaged before they get sent out of the building. However, if we do not have the elevator, this is where the stairwell evacuation group comes into play. And this is probably the most effective part of this whole process. Instead of having staff members go from first floor to fourth floor and back and forth, is that we end up basically, again, bucket brigade, where we take a few people per landing, and you pass the resident patient down landing by landing by landing by landing, so that staff are really only going through a motion of 7, 8, 9, 10 stairs going up and down versus 3, 4, 5, 6 plus flights of stairs. So we're trying to control the amount of energy that staff are using as we have to do that stairwell evacuation process. We'll point out that typically in our plans, what we also try doing is that we try to predetermine where these elevators, where these stairwells are actually formed in a good day. Obviously, at the time of the disaster, if there's structural damage and we lose a stairwell, well, we got to rethink the wheel. But the goal is that we always look at these facilities as saying that we want to have a designated stairwell for people coming down. At the same time, we want a designated stairwell for staff and equipment to go back up or emergency services to go up. The last thing we want to have doing is fire department trying to go up a stair as staff are trying to bring people down a stair. So we try to control the flow throughout the building as well. So as we look at those groups, we've got one group that is specifically assigned to do that floor evacuation. You've got the 2 potentially the vertical evacuation, which is your elevator or your stair groups, which then hands off to our discharge group, which takes them down the hallway to our holding area. Again, trying to control the flow of that vertical evacuation. We also try to look at where are some of the potential holding areas that we would use for each site, each building. It may be one, it may be two, depending upon the size of the building. It may be two or three, depending upon the types of occupancy we have in the building. It may be that we're going to do if you're a multi-service campus, you might have a skilled, you might have an assisted living holding area. You might also have a memory care, dementia holding area. Depending upon the skill levels or the amount of staff, the time that we have, it may be one, it may be three, depending upon what's appropriate for your facility. And then identifying where is an appropriate pickup location from that site, that holding area that's within the building. And can vehicular access be gained from that entrance? So a main dining room may be a great large open area to use as a holding area. However, if it's buried within the building and there's no direct access to get to vehicles, it may not be the best holding area for us when it comes time for evacuating people out. Coordinating transportation. One of the things, this is in that documents folder that's in the lower right-hand corner of your screen right now as you look at this. This particular file that you're seeing, the pictures you're seeing right here, we always give this to clients to try to determine, in the event we have to evacuate, what types of transportation resources or equipment are we going to need. And I would encourage all the sites, all of you that are here, to use this tool, use it as a practice. There's two things that you're going to see here. The first one is, I believe I got a bigger picture for you, is this one here. It is the Evacuation Transportation Survey. It is meant for each unit, each department, each floor to go through and to identify for the residents or patients that are on their floor, what types of transportation needs will I need based on the people that are on my floor. So as you look at it from a hospital, we're going to get more of those that are going to need critical care transport, ALF and BLS transport, ambulance type transport, than we are going to be those that can hop in a car and on a normal bus. Whereas we hit the assisted living to independent, we're going to hit the other spectrum. But what this allows for each unit to do is to say, how many of each means and method do I need, and be able to have them process it for you so that that information can come back to the command center. So when the fire department says, what do you need for transport? Here's your breakdown as to what do you need per unit, per area. What I would encourage you to do is don't wait for an event to happen. I would literally take this and tomorrow, take this survey, take it and send it out to your floors and say, by the end of the day, tell me based on today's census, what would you need? Then take that information into the next tool that was sent to you, which is the transportation aggregate tool, and you can then go down the left-hand side, put down all those units and floors, and start to tally together to see, okay, how many beds do I have on that floor? What amount of transportation do I need? And then do I have things like vents? Do I have people on oxygen? What are the total number of people that I have? How does this become valuable? Well, tomorrow, you do it tomorrow. Come next Monday, all these numbers are going to change. However, it gives you a starting point. You can then take that sheet and say, even a month from now, here's what I need, start with this, and I'm going to get more updated information in a minute as other people are starting to update their tools. It gives us a starting point to be what's there. I will also tell you that it's an important tool for you to see, but it's even more important for emergency services. I will kind of share from my perspective. I'm also a firefighter up here in Rochester, New York, as well as working on an ambulance. I did this with one of our local nursing homes, and after doing the aggregate, walking through all the units, I went to both my fire chief and to the operations chief of the ambulance corps, and I said, if this building over here, this 250-bed nursing home, had to evacuate, what would you call for? And both of them gave me the same answer. I would call for every ambulance that I possibly could find in the county. I looked at them and said, based on this aggregate, you need 2 ambulances. The rest could go out on a wheelchair bus. Most people don't understand what's going on in the building until you can break it down and present them what's truly happening. So it could be a good tool for you, but also a good learning experience for those emergency services that are surrounding you at the same time. So it helps us to determine what do we really need as far as those levels of care and even specialties. So is it we looking at a critical care transport, or is it a bariatric critical care transport? Because those are going to be two totally different transportation means when it comes time for evacuating people out. Those specialty care transports are definitely going to be something we're going to have to look at, mainly on the hospital end or some select nursing home sides of the spectrum as well. Patient preparation. What we typically have, and I'm also going to show you here in a minute, is an example of a resident evacuation tracking form. We put this together, and we've used this for multiple different mutual aid plans and different variations and versions. But basically, it's a triplicate form that goes through and identifies what are some of the key pertinent medical information about that individual. Quick little check boxes. Some facilities actually choose to fill out the top portion of the form and have it in their charts ready to go at all times. Others, they just do it at the time of. And then there's portions of it that get filled out as the evacuation takes place, and it becomes a tracking tool as well, not just a resident medical record type tool. We always encourage that when we can, that we package any hard copy charts to go with that particular person. If we have time, yes, copying is always available. Basically, I try to get people to look at it from reverse. You know, it's one thing that you don't want to give it up as you're evacuating out, but if you're going to be accepting people, you're going to want to have information to be able to at least start the care for that individual until their staff show up and start servicing your own. Packaging of any personal belongings, dentures, hearing aids, glasses, any of those types of effects. And typically we say package, put them in a pillowcase, that type of thing that we can have them go with them. And ensuring that they are identified so we can match them up with the personal effects, the medical record, the tracking form as we're going forward. I threw this in here as well because I know it's kind of a wide range of how people have medical records. A lot of people now are transitioning to electronic medical records, but yet there are still some that are out there that were hard copy. When you look at your full building evacuation plans, you're going to want to look at, if your electronic records, what can we do? What do you already have that's still hard copy? What do you have that you'd have to print? If you, again, were the receiving facility, what would you want? What are your capabilities? Can you batch plot so that you can put out multiple things at a time? Can you print out multiple resident or patients at a time? Can you do it just at the nursing unit? Can you do it at an off-site location? So if you left the facility, could you go someplace else, print it, and then have it catch up to that resident? Can you do it at that receiving site, or can you give permission to the receiving site to be able to do that? So a lot of this is going to really focus with what your knowledge is of your electronic system, as well as what IT permissions are going to be able to be granted, but also making sure that this is called out in your full building evacuation plan. What I'm showing here is just kind of a sample as to how some of that verbiage comes into play. Here is a sample of that resident evacuation tracking form that we're looking at, that I was referring to. The upper portion of it really is looking at the person. Who is it that we're sending? What's their typical diagnosis? What is it that we are tracking? We're tracking them. We're tracking the medical record, personal effects, and medications on this sheet. Are they identified? Who identified them? And then there's things like the fall risk, wander risk, special dietary needs. Depending upon the pace of the evacuation, you may not have to fill out all of that if we're going at a faster pace. Down below at the very bottom, what time did they actually get into the holding area? Who sent them out of the holding area? Where did they get sent to? What receiving facility? And what vehicle took them there? So if now all of a sudden we end up having somebody disappear, they don't show up at their receiving site, we have a way to call back and say, ambulance 3479 transported this patient. They were supposed to go to ABC facility. They didn't make it there. Where'd you transport them? So you have a way to backtrack that information. And then once they get there, here's the other possibility of locating them, is that we're also documenting on that form where were they received, who received them, and the objective is that in one way, shape, or form, that facility can send that copy back to us. They could fax it, they could email it, scan it, take a picture of it, so that we have a paper trail as to where did that resident end up or that patient end up at that period of time. So again, this is just another means and method for tracking of individuals. We talked already about this, so I'll just kind of summarize it quickly here, but when we look at our buildings, we always try to pre-assign which stairwells and elevators are going to get used for evacuation. Here's on the west stairwell, we're used for evacuation of people. East stairwell, same thing. We split the building in half. We got 2 elevators for one side, 2 elevators for the other, but yet we've designated the south stairwell to be strictly for staff and emergency and fire department use only, so that we don't have people trying to come down that same stairwell. And this is typically included in a full building evacuation plan. In larger scale facilities, now your plans start to get more like this as we start looking at multiple areas, multiple elevators, multiple stairwells, but we can color code them to be able to figure out how is that evacuation going to start to take place. Question always comes up, can we use elevators? Well, that's up to emergency services, and it depends upon the situation. If it's a loss of power, if it's a generator, it's on the fritz, we may not be able to do it. If it's a fire situation, you're probably not going to be able to do it. We always want to be prepared that we have to use stairs only, and that emergency services may not give us permission to use those elevators. Another question to ask yourselves as you're looking at these stairwells and elevators is that, do those stairwells allow re-entry back into the building? I find a lot of times people look at the plans and they use a floor plan to say, well, I'm going to use this one for residents, this one for emergency services, but yet they don't conduct a walkthrough to actually look at the stairwells to identify that, this stairwell really is not conducive to being able to evacuate people down, and it doesn't allow entry back in the building, it only discharges back outside. So truly take the time to walk through your building as you start to put together, if we had to evacuate, how are we going to do it and what path is there. Now we talk about identifying those stairs and elevators in the plan, but at the same time, are those elevators identified in the building? If you end up saying the staff members use the west stair, do they know what west stair is? I'd find a lot of times they don't, but it could be they have to be re-identified. It could be the fact that, again, we're telling the fire department for fire department entry, go and use the west stair, but on the inside of the building, they may say west stair, but on the outside of the building, it says nothing. Is there an identifier on the outside of the building so that the fire department knows this is the door, entrance, or stairwell that they would need to know? So clear identification is definitely key when it comes time for doing this. And that applies for staff use, emergency services use, and both for the elevators and the stairwells, predetermining those routes and labeling them. Can that stairwell or even elevator accommodate that evacuation process? Can they take people to going down the stairs? Can that elevator accommodate a stretcher or a wheelchair or a geriatric chair? Look at the resources of how you would evacuate, and can we get down those stairs with the equipment or resources that we are going to use? Practice with the equipment that you have to test those different stairwells. All right, one quick question that we're going to toss out here for you is this interactive poll question on evacuation equipment. Which of the following applies to your facility in regards to vertical evacuation equipment? 1, we are a single-story facility. 2, we're a multiple-story facility but do not have evacuation equipment designed for evacuation. And 3, we're a multiple-story facility and we have vertical evacuation equipment like evacuation chairs. We got a lot of lucky people on the line that are single-story facilities. All right, well, that kind of helps to kind of share where we're spreading here, and we'll go with some of this conversation. But for those folks that do have evacuation equipment and that are multi-story facilities, and even for those that are not, when we look at a couple of things here that we always talk about for evacuation. And this one here, the sheet slide technique, we typically talk about in more or less like a fire situation. It's an emergent. We got to get them out of the room. We got to do it quickly. We don't have time to go and grab a lift, but what can we do to get the person off the bed? And this sheet slide rescue technique is a method which we can use to slide the person off the bed onto the floor and drag and remove the person from the room so that we can, in a fire situation, close, contain, confine the fire to that space, and then we can worry about how are we going to continue to move on from there. However, in a full building evacuation type situation, we shouldn't be sliding people onto the floor and dragging them down the hallway. Sheets are typically looked at as a vertical means and method for carrying people down the stairs. I will tell you from experience, this is not very easy to do. It is very basic. It is a very challenging means and method, and depending upon the sheets, they pull, stretch, or tear right out from underneath you. There's a variety of different equipment that is there for, again, vertical or even horizontal transportation down the hallway. If depending upon your slings that are already in buildings, you could end up using slings. There's equipment like Smith cots or Perry pouches, which is the picture you see right here, where you can have 4 handles carrying people down the hallways and through doors as a means and method. But at the same time, this is a carrying method that requires a significant amount of work. They do have, as I said of the questions, different types of specialized equipment like stair chairs or evacuation chairs. These are both very effective when it comes time for vertical evacuation. However, depending upon the types of occupant where we're trying to evacuate, it also depends upon the type of equipment you want to use. The stair chairs are good. However, they do have restrictions when it comes to the amount of weight that they can do, and it is a lot of lift. There's a lot of maneuvering that has to be done with those stair chairs. The benefit when it comes time for facilities is the cost is significantly less than when it comes time for looking at an evacuation chair that typically runs you anywhere between about $1,800 to $2,300 per chair. The evacuation chairs, though, control a lot more of the weight, and when you're in those bariatric situations where you get people that are in 400, 500 pounds, they do have equipment like evacuation chairs that will be able to handle that amount of weight to be able to get people vertically downstairs when we cannot use the elevators. For those of you that are multi-story facilities, I would always encourage you to look at what works best for you and make sure that your equipment works for your facility and for your staff. Don't assume that emergency services will be able to provide you equipment, because most of the time they probably will not, and you'll be independent of having to figure out how to do it. The other means that are out there, we have different things like evacuation sleds. There's the paraslide, there's the evacuation sled or evacu sled, and the med sled. All of them have little different pros and cons to them. The paraslide is more of a plastic corrugated cardboard kind of sled. It doesn't hold up as well from experiences that I've had. We've got med sleds that it's a plastic sled. You can see on the far right-hand side. It does have some more devices to help the control with the descent. It makes it easier to get the people downstairs. And the evacuation sled, which is on the lower left-hand corner, is a good device. It's a nice little device. However, the challenge with this device is it's meant to be under each and every mattress in the building, that if we need it, you pull it out from under the mattress, wrap the person up, and you literally roll them down the hallway. There are about 50, 60 little tiny wheels underneath the bottom of this mattress as you roll the person down the hallway with this piece of equipment. So there's a lot of different resources out there. Take a look at what is the most appropriate for your facility and the types of occupants that are in your building. Kind of summing up some of this here for full building evacuation, the biggest thing that we've got to look at is making sure that as we're looking for the receiving sites is that we are doing matching like-for-like care, matching the acuity levels, and making sure that we're maintaining those relationships with other facilities in amongst the mutual aid plan, and making sure that we remember that this tracking process is our responsibility. As that evacuating facility, it's our responsibility to track from the time they leave the unit to a holding area to the point they get on a vehicle to where they end up going, whether it be a stopover point or at a receiving facility. Tracking should be done at multiple different levels so that we don't end up losing somebody. And I always emphasize to people when we're teaching classes that you could evacuate 1,000 people out of a building, but if you lose one, everybody's going to remember that one. They're not going to remember the 999 that we successfully got out. So it's focusing our attention on the tracking and the safety of the occupants. Okay, so we got another quick question here. What percentage would you say your influx surge plan include provisions for feeding, drinking, bathing, hygiene, and sleeping for residents, patients, staff, volunteers, and any other visitors that could be in the building at the time of an incident? All right, so we got some answers slowly starting to come in. Good. Glad to see they're all up in the ones and twos. That's a good thing. Because all of these things that are here that we just listed off, at a minimum, have to be addressed in our influx and surge plan. And as we start to look at that, I think one of the big things that people need to look at and understand is the difference between influx and surge. Influx is you taking residents in or patients in, and you are filling any open beds that you may have inside of the facility at the time. Surge is you're taking people in above and beyond those open beds and going above and beyond what your licensed capacity would be. That's when we're now taking day rooms and dining rooms and activity rooms or therapy rooms, and we're starting to fill those spaces with people that are normally not there in a resident care capacity. So as we start to look at the influx and surge capacity plan, there's a couple of things that we want to start to look at and evaluate. And there's also a couple of tools that we're going to provide for you to be able to assess your own buildings, is to look at what can we do when it comes time for handling that internal surge and that external surge when it comes time for our own internal events that could take place where we're doing like a horizontal shift, like a fire or structural damage on part of a building, or we're getting that external surge where we've got community that's now coming in or another healthcare facility evacuating to us, and we're trying to assist with that resident accepting, being that resident accepting facility. So the first thing, and obviously we are going to look at, is what vacant licensed beds can we go through and fill, and then start to assess what other areas after that can we go through and start to expand. So once we've done that influx of filling licensed beds, what surge areas can we start to go through and fill? If it's a hospital, what could we do for procedural or surgical areas that we could start taking? Maybe it's a single room and turning into a double, or a double into a triple, or a nursing home where we're taking areas that are a therapy room and we're taking and adding 3, 4, maybe 5 room beds to that room, but now have to determine, in order to do that surge of those non-really patient care areas, what is it that we're going to need to do that? What types of equipment? What types of resources does that space have? But at the same time, what types of resources would we need to get? Things like privacy curtains. Would we need to get oxygen tanks? Would we need to get a crash cart to be available in that room if we're now taking a non-resident care room, like a dining room, and turning it into basically another nursing unit? What types of resources do we need for that area? There's also typically some rules of thumb that we give out to staff members as you start to predetermine where these rooms or spaces would end up being. And it's more than just saying, yeah, it looks good, we're going to put 7 people inside of this room, but we want to make sure that bed space is there, but also the care space is there to be able to handle the patients that are there, as well as the egress path to be able to do that. And as you see here, there's a couple of rules of thumb, and typically what we look at is that on each side of a bed, we've got 1.5 feet. That allows us to gain access to the patient in the bed, and then 3 feet between 2 beds. Patient ends up coding on us. We want to be able to get the patient off the bed onto the floor. We've got a way to be able to do that, or get enough people around to be able to address that particular patient, and still have that egress window to be able to get people in and out of that room as need be. So as you see the simple little layout in the diagram that we have here, where there's 1 foot, you got about the 3-foot bed, 3-foot space. As you work your way down this room, we're looking at a max of about 6 beds in that particular space. So we're looking at the overall space management that we can do for that particular environment. One of the tools that we have provided for you, again in the folder in the lower right-hand corner, is this Surge Influx Plan tool. And what this does is it gives you basically a simple little spreadsheet to look at each area which we think is a good surge area, like a dining room or a med surge area that we're going to create additional beds, or an overflow area. What's our ability? The first column is what's our ability to be able to set up that space. Can we do it in 0 to 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours, or it's going to take an extended period of time? What's our priority for surge? So if we know we're going to be surging and we need rooms, is this a high priority room or is it a low priority room? Can we get beds out of this space? How many beds? We're looking at getting additional 12 beds out of this space. If we did that, then we also need how many staff members? So you can say right off the bat, I'm going to need, this first column gives us a dining activities room that's going to take 0 to 2 hours to set up. It's a high priority room. You can get 12 beds for additional surge into that space. It only needs 1 more staff member licensed, 1 more CNA. But at the same time, in order to do that, they're going to need 12 additional beds. There's no beds in the dining room. They're going to have to get 12 beds. And they're also going to need necessary supplies. They're going to need 6 privacy screens, 12 tap bells, and then is it a secured locked area? No, it's not. And then additional comments for setup instructions over in the far right-hand column. Things like oxygen, emergency power inside of that room, notes that we can make. So you can go through and start to pre-assess some of the areas in your building and say, okay, if I'm going to use this room as a surge space, what do I need to do it? And you can start to pre-factor in some of those equations before it gets too late. So here's just a couple of blow-ups of this. You can see it a little bit clearer for those of you that did not download the actual document yet. But as you can see here, here's where you prioritize in that first column your ability to set up and your surge priority and the number of residents, in this case 12, that they can get out of that one room. Additional staff, 1 licensed. They got 1 CNA that they're saying is required for that room. And as a result, they also need 12 additional beds, 6 privacy screens, 12 tap bells. And then here's the additional setup instructions that would need for this. So in order for using this room, they also identified in here that we need to remove all the tables, all the chairs, all the furniture, replace with beds, cots, mattresses, along with front side entrance room to set up 12 beds. That's still a lot of work, and they're calling out here saying that they can do it in 0 to 2 hours. So it's identifying what can we do for each one of these particular spaces. Additionally, what can be useful is taking and calling out on a floor plan which rooms can be used and how would that layout and setup take place. And here's just a kind of a sample floor plan looking at it, and they call over on the upper left-hand side what the overall surge capacity could be and the expansion using the dining room, and they're also using some of the resident rooms where they can gain additional surge space by doing some moving around of resources in the building. Come on. So at this point, we're kind of coming up on our time here and want to open it up here if anybody has any questions. I do see that we have one question that has popped up here in our little chat box, and a reminder that that is the way that we will be taking questions. The lower left-hand corner, that there is a little chat window that you can toss questions into. The first question was, will the PowerPoint be available after the webinar? And the answer to that is certainly. We can very easily make the PowerPoint available so that people can access it. And Rich is also recording it for us, so it'll also be presented so that everybody will be able to rewatch it and see it that way as well. Do you have any other questions that are out there? So one of the questions that I will toss out at you is, I know, again, we've got a lot of variety of different levels of care that we have out here. Full building and the surge and influx is one of the big areas that the new CMS requirements has been hitting. The 17 level of care providers in the last year have been hit with those requirements. And specifically, as you start looking at these plans, it's not just about the staff and residents, but making sure that they are also looking at it from the volunteers' perspective as well. That even if we are taking and we're utilizing those volunteers for the assistance of evacuation, whether it be using them in the labor pool or staff members going to an alternate care site, when we start sending people, it's also about tracking those individuals as well. So we emphasize a lot about tracking residents and patients, but it's also a lot about tracking where is it our staff and or volunteers are going once we start to evacuate them as well. Because eventually those folks are going to have to go to receiving facilities to begin continuing the care for those patients which we've just evacuated out. We've got a couple other things just popped up here. Okay, so we just got here that the HCC will post the webinar and support materials on the HCC website soon. So that'll be out there as well. So if you were not able to download anything on the file or the folder, which is also in the lower right-hand corner, it'll be available there as well. There's another question here, and I'll be honest, I do not know the answer to it, but the certificate of attendance for the CMS manual, I do not know in regards to the answer to that, but I will write it down and see if I can figure out what the answer is for you and get back to you. And or if there's somebody else on here that can chime in and let us know, that'll work as well. But any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for everybody's attendance and the questions that we ended up getting. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach back out to us, and have a great afternoon.